400 years. That is the gap in most Bibles between the last prophet and the first gospel. 400 years of divine activity that most of the world was never shown. Not because the record does not exist, because someone in a specific room, in a specific century, made a specific decision about what you were allowed to receive. That decision did not destroy the record. It only changed who would eventually hold it and the tradition that kept it. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, with its 81 books, while the rest of the world was handed 66, did not keep it carelessly. It kept it the way you keep something that was given to you for someone who had not yet arrived. Pause. You who were meant to hear this, that generation, is listening tonight. Closer, there were people who died so these words would survive. Not metaphorically. People who copied these texts in rooms where discovery meant death, who carried them across mountains in cedar chests wrapped in cloth that smelled of incense, from the churches where the copying was done, who passed them from hand to hand through the Aksumite highlands, through the long centuries, when empire after empire decided that the sacred record of a small people was an obstacle to the order they were building. The elder does not speak their names tonight. Their names are not the point. Their work is the point. And their work is what you are receiving right now. Ancient 7 books. That is what the 400 years produced, that most traditions set aside. 7 texts written between the last prophet and the first gospel, in the centuries when God was still speaking to anyone willing to listen carefully enough to write it down. Sirach, who stood at the beginning of the silence and recorded what wisdom sounds like when it speaks in its own voice. The wisdom of Solomon, written in Alexandria for a generation living under pressure from a culture that did not value what they had received. Tobit, which preserved the architecture of the unseen world inside the shape of an ordinary life. Judith, which kept the record of what sacred daring looks like when the institutions have already decided to surrender. First Maccabees, which recorded in real names and real dates the war for these texts, the one that was fought, not for territory, but for whether these books would survive. The Prayer of Manasseh, the shortest text in the vault, and the heaviest, the prayer of the man who deserved it least and needed it most. And to Baruch, the last book, the oldest seal, the one the elder has carried the longest, because what Baruch saw from inside the ruins of everything the others had fought to protect. Reasoning is a description of this generation, of this hour, of the person who was always going to be the one to finally receive what was sealed in the wreckage of a city that had already burned twice. The vault is opening tonight. All 7 rooms, in the order they were always meant to be opened. The elder has kept this long enough. It belongs to you now. Pause. But first, one question. The question that no tradition, no council, no century of careful decisions about what you were and were not allowed to hold has ever fully answered. Why did they keep it when keeping it meant death? That is where we begin. 400 years. Say that slowly, not as a number, as a duration. 400 years of empires moving through the land where the sacred record had its home. 400 years of people being told in 4 different languages by 4 different powers that what they had received from their fathers was less important than what the current empire needed them to believe. Pause. Babylon had already come and gone. It took the people and left the land empty. Persia came next and let the people return, but the world they returned to was not the world they had left. Then Greece, and Greece was different from everything that had come before, because Babylon wanted the land and Persia wanted the tribute. But Greece wanted the mind. The Hellenizing program of the Greek Empire and then of Antiochus IV was not a military campaign in the ordinary sense. It was a cultural replacement, a deliberate, systematic, patient effort to convince an entire people that their texts, their calendar, their dietary practice, their language, their understanding of God were provincial, were the beliefs of a small people who had not yet caught up to the sophistication of the larger world. Pause, and it nearly worked. The elder does not say this to diminish the people who resisted. The elder says it because the texts you are receiving tonight were written inside that pressure, not after it was over, not from a safe distance, not by people who knew how the story ended, by people who did not know whether it would end at all. Ancient. Then Rome. Rome came last, and Rome was the most total, because Rome did not need to replace the mind. Rome simply replaced everything. The temple fell in 70 of the Common Era, and the world that had produced these 7 texts, these 7 books of the 400 years, was gone. Pause. And yet, the texts survived, all 7 of them, through Babylon, through Persia, through Greece, through the Maccabean War that was fought specifically to keep them alive, through Rome, through the temples burning, through the councils of the 4th and 5th centuries that sat in specific rooms and made specific decisions about which of these books belonged in the canon and which did not. Through all of it, the texts survived. And the question, you who were meant to hear this, is not whether they survived. The question is why. Why did the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church keep what the Council of Laodicea in 363 of the Common Era declined to include? Why did the tradition that produced the largest Christian biblical canon on earth, 81 books, look at what the Western councils were setting aside and say, no, not this. This stays. Pause. The elder has sat with that question longer than most people have thought to ask it. And the answer is not administrative. It is not about different councils having different rules. It is not about one tradition being more permissive than another, about what counts as scripture. Closer. The answer is prophetic. The Ethiopian Orthodox tradition kept these 7 books because the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition understood something about what these books were doing that the Western councils, in their specific rooms, in their specific centuries, did not fully see. These books were not describing the past. They were describing a generation that had not yet arrived. Pause. Sirach knew that wisdom would one day speak to people who had never heard her voice and would recognize it immediately. The wisdom of Solomon knew that a generation would live under the pressure of a dominant culture that did not value what they had received and would need to be told that what they received was worth the pressure. Tobit knew that a generation would exist in a world where the unseen had been explained away and would need the architecture of what it had been told was not there, preserved, intact, waiting. Judith knew that a generation would face a moment when the institutions had decided to accommodate the empire, and a person acting from the interior of the tradition, rather than its official edges, would have to decide whether to act. First Maccabees knew that a generation would hold texts that other people had died to preserve, without knowing the cost of what they were holding. The Prayer of Manasseh knew that a generation would feel too far gone to turn back and would need to hear the prayer of the person who was farther gone than anyone, and turned back anyway. And to Baruch knew that a generation would exist at the moment the text calls, the nearness of the end of the age. When the youth of the world is past, and the strength of the creation already exhausted, and would need to be told that what survived the last burning is still intact, still sealed, still waiting for the one who chose to look for it, reasoning that generation is not coming. You who were meant to hear this, that generation is here tonight. In this room, in whoever stayed long enough to let the question settle into them, rather than rushing toward an answer they already had. Pause. The question has 7 answers. Each one is a book. The first book is the oldest of them. Written by a man who stood at the very beginning of the 400 years before the silence had fully fallen, before the Greek Empire had made its full intentions known, before the war for the texts had been declared. A man who looked at everything his tradition had received and understood with a clarity that feels almost impossible, from inside the moment that what had been given could be lost, and wrote it down so it could not be. His name was Jesus ben Sira, and what he wrote is the first room in the vault, the first seal opening now. Before the first seal opens, one quiet mark. You who were meant to hear this, a subscribe, places you in the record of those who received what was almost lost. That is all it is. Not a transaction, not an algorithm, not a favor to this channel. A mark that says, I was here. I received this. I am among those who stayed for the full transmission. Closer, and before the first seal opens, the elder wants to leave. One question in the room, not about the texts, not about the 400 years. Something simpler. What would you do if you knew that a prophecy had been written specifically for your generation? Honor. One line in the comments is enough. The elder reads what is written there. Now, the first seal is ready. His name was Jesus ben Sira, not the name most people reach for when they hear that name. A teacher, a scribe, a man who lived in Jerusalem in the years around 180 before the Common Era, which means he was writing before the Maccabean War began, before Antiochus IV had declared his intentions, before the decree went out that possession of the covenant texts was punishable by death. Ben Sira was writing in the last years of a world that did not yet know how close it was to burning. Pause. And what he wrote in those last years of the world before the fire was not a warning. It was an invitation. The book that bears his name, Sirach, called Ecclesiasticus in the Latin tradition, called the Wisdom of Ben Sira in the scholarly tradition, and kept without apology in the Ethiopian Orthodox canon as one of the 81 books that the Tewahedo Church decided the people of God needed to have, opens with a declaration that most people in the traditions that removed this book have never heard. Closer, all wisdom comes from the Lord and is with him forever. That is the first line. Not a prayer, not an invocation, not a throat clearing, before the real content begins. A declaration, all wisdom comes from the Lord and is with him forever. Pause. The elder has carried that line a long time because it does not say wisdom is a quality that careful people develop over years of study and experience. It does not say, wisdom is a reward for righteous living. It says wisdom comes from somewhere. It has a source. It has a location. It has been with that source forever. And the rest of chapter 24 tells you what wisdom did with all that time. Ancient. Now, the word I want to give you here, you who were meant to hear this, is the word the Ethiopian tradition uses for the specific kind of wisdom that speaks in Sirach 24. The word is Ḥəkmat. Ḥəkmat in Gez, the ancient liturgical language that the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church has never stopped speaking. In its stone churches, in its highland monasteries, in the services that begin before midnight and continue through the long cold dark until morning. Ḥəkmat does not mean wisdom as intellectual capacity. It does not describe the accumulation of knowledge over a long life, carefully observed. Ḥəkmat is wisdom as a being, not a principle, not a quality, not an attribute of the divine, that you might approximate if you are disciplined enough. A being, one that existed before creation, that was with God, at the formation of the world, that pitched its tent in a specific place among a specific people and took up permanent residence, not in a temple, not in a throne room, not in a place accessible only to the ordained, but among them, in the middle of their ordinary life. Pause. Sirach chapter 24 records Ḥəkmat speaking in her own voice, and what she says is the passage that the scribes of the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition copied with particular care in the highland monasteries, in the stone rooms carved from the living rock of the Lalibela churches. She says, I came forth from the mouth of the Most High and covered the earth like a mist. I dwelt in the highest heavens, and my throne was in a pillar of cloud. Alone I compassed the vault of heaven and traversed the depths of the abyss. Klotzer. The elder wants you to stay with that image for a moment before it becomes theology, before it becomes a doctrinal position about the nature of divine wisdom and its relationship to the second person of the Trinity, and all the careful argumentation that followed this text through 15 centuries of commentary. Before all of that, stay with the image, something that came from the mouth of God, covered the earth like a mist, not like a lightning bolt, not like a proclamation, not like the kind of divine action that announces itself with signs and fire and the parting of waters, like a mist. Pause. The kind of presence that is everywhere at once, that touches everything simultaneously, that you breathe in without deciding to, that is already on your skin. Before you have noticed, it arrived. That is what Ḥəkmat says she does. In the world, she covers it like a mist. Ancient. Now, the preservation history of this specific word ins is one of the most specific texts in the entire record of the 400 years Ben Sira wrote in Hebrew in Jerusalem around 180 before the Common Era. His grandson translated the text into Greek sometime after 132 before the Common Era, and the Greek translation is what most of the ancient world received. The Hebrew original disappeared for nearly 1,000 years. Scholars believed that the Hebrew Ben Sira was gone, that what survived was only the translation, only the Greek, only the secondary text, not the hand of the man himself. Then, in 1896, a storage room was opened in a synagogue in Cairo. The room is called a geniza, which means treasury or storehouse. In Jewish tradition, sacred texts that can no longer be used because they are damaged or worn or contain the name of God and therefore cannot simply be discarded, are placed in a geniza and kept. The Ben Ezra synagogue in Cairo had been placing texts in its geniza for approximately 1,000 years without anyone cataloging what was accumulating inside. When scholars finally entered and began examining what 1,000 years of keeping had produced, they found fragments of the original Hebrew Ben Sira, pages that had been written in the language of the man himself, placed in a room not to be preserved, but simply because they could not be thrown away and had sat there accumulating while the world outside believed they were gone. The Cairo Geniza held approximately 300,000 fragments of sacred texts, manuscript pages, personal letters, legal documents, in Hebrew and Aramaic and Judeo-Arabic. 300,000 fragments sitting in a room in Cairo for 1,000 years, waiting closer. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church did not need the Cairo Geniza to tell it that Sirach was worth keeping. The Ethiopian canon had been reading Sirach in Ge'ez without interruption for 15 centuries in the island monasteries of Lake Tana, where manuscripts have been copied by hand. Since the earliest translations made in the Aksumite period, the 4th and 5th centuries of the Common Era, in the rock-hewn churches of Lalibela, where the scribes descended into underground rooms before the service began and read Sirach aloud in the compressed silence of the living rock. In the liturgical calendar of the Tewahedo Church, which has never stopped treating Sirach as scripture, while the rest of the world was deciding whether it belonged ancient, and what the Ethiopian scribes who copied Ḥəkmat generation after generation understood that the councils who set this book aside did not fully see, is what Sirach chapter 24 says at the end. After wisdom has described her traversing of the heavens, her dwelling in the high places, her pitching of her tent among the people, she says this: "Come to me, you who desire me, and eat your fill of my fruits. Pause. The Ethiopian scribes who copied that line did not read it as poetry. They read it as an open invitation, still standing, not closed by any council, not expired with the Hebrew original, not rendered obsolete by anything that happened in the 15 centuries between Ben Sira's pen and this moment. Still open, still extended. Come to me, you who desire me. The generation that was told this book was not quite canonical, not quite authoritative, not quite worth including. In the Bible they were handed, lost that invitation. The elder does not say that lightly. You lose something when wisdom stops speaking to you in your own canon. You lose the sound of her voice. You lose the specific weight of what it sounds like when the divine speaks, not in commandments, not in prophecy, not in narrative, but in invitation. Come to me, closer. The scribes who kept this word did not keep it for a council to approve. They kept it because wisdom was speaking, and they could not stop their ears. Pause. Sirach stood at the beginning of the 400 years and recorded what Ḥəkmat sounds like in her own voice. The Ethiopian Orthodox canon kept that recording intact, and tonight, you who were meant to hear this, the invitation that was removed from most of the Bibles your tradition handed you, is being extended again. Come to me, you who desire me. You are here, reasoning. But Sirach is the oldest of the 7. He stood at the beginning of the silence, when the prophets had not yet gone quiet. The second book in this vault was written after the silence had already fallen. Hainor, written by people living under the full weight of a culture that had decided their tradition was provincial, and their God was one option among many nomer. And what it says about that pressure, about what it feels like to carry something sacred inside a world that does not value what you are carrying, is the most precise description of the present moment that any ancient text has preserved. The elder opens it next. Alexandria. In the last century before the Common Era, Alexandria was the most cosmopolitan city on earth. Not cosmopolitan in the way we use that word now to mean sophisticated or worldly or open to many things. Cosmopolitan in the original sense of the word. A city of the cosmos, a place where the entire known world arrived and lived and pressed against itself. Greek philosophy, Egyptian religion, Roman law, Jewish scripture, Persian mysticism, all of it in one city at the same time. Pause. And inside that city, in the last century, before the Common Era, a community of Jewish scholars was living with a question that has never fully gone away. How do you carry something sacred inside a world that does not value what you are carrying? How do you hold a tradition that came from a specific place, in a specific language, to a specific people, bound inside a culture that has decided all specific traditions are provincial, and the only thing worth holding is the universal, the rational, the philosophical, the Greek? Pause. That question is not ancient. You who were meant to hear this, that question is tonight. It is the question of every person who has tried to hold something received from their fathers inside a world that keeps telling them what they received is not sophisticated enough for the world they are living in. The wisdom of Solomon was written for that person. Ancient. Now, the word I want to give you here is the word the Ethiopian tradition uses in its Ge'ez rendering of the Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 7, for the specific breath that connects the divine to the created world. The word is Ra. Ra. In Ge'ez, Ra does not mean breath in the biological sense of the air the lungs require to keep the body running. Ra carries the weight of animating principle, the specific quality of divine breath that when it contacts something makes it alive in a way it was not before. Not alive in the physical sense of a heart beating and blood moving through vessels that know what they are supposed to do. Alive in the sense of being in contact with its source. Pause of knowing where it came from, and in that knowing becoming more fully what it was made to be. That is Ru, and the Wisdom of Solomon. Chapter 7 uses this word in a passage that the elder has carried longer than almost any other in the 7 books of the 400 years. Closer, because it is the passage that describes what wisdom is, not in the language of metaphor, not in the language of poetry, that gestures toward something it cannot quite name, but in 21 specific attributes. 21. The Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 7, gives wisdom 21 qualities, listed one after another, with the precision of someone who has been close enough to the thing they are describing to know that approximation is not enough. Ancient, intelligent, holy, unique, manifold, subtle, mobile, clear, unpolluted, distinct, invulnerable, loving the good, keen, irresistible, beneficent, humane, steadfast, sure, free from anxiety, all-powerful, overseeing all and penetrating through all spirits. Pause. 21 attributes. And then, after the list is complete, after the scholar in Alexandria has given everything he knows about what wisdom is, he arrives at the line that the Ethiopian scribes copied with the most care. For wisdom is a breath of the power of God and a pure emanation of the glory of the Almighty. Therefore, nothing defiled gains entrance into her, for she is a reflection of eternal light, a spotless mirror of the working of God, and an image of His goodness. pause. The elder stops here for a moment, not to explain it, to let it be what it is before the explanation arrives and makes it smaller than the thing itself, a breath of the power of God, not a thought of God, not a decision of God, not a commandment of God, a breath, the thing that moves from the inside of a being outward without being fully separate from the being it came from, still carrying the warmth of where it originated, but still connected by the invisible thread of having been breathed by the one who breathed it, ancient. The early Christian theologians who built the foundational language of what the Church would teach about the nature of the divine drew on this passage, the language of wisdom, as breath of the power of God, as reflection of eternal light, as image of His goodness, became the language that described what the Logos was in relation to the Father, the theological framework that millions of people hold tonight without knowing its source was built on a book that the tradition which holds it then decided to remove from its own canon. Pause. The elder does not say that as an accusation. The elder says it because the listener who has spent years holding theological convictions that feel deeper than the tradition they received has a right to know where those depths came from. They came from Alexandria. They came from a community living under pressure, from a culture that told them what they had received was not sophisticated enough. They came from a scholar who sat down in the middle of that pressure and wrote 21 attributes of the thing he loved most, because he needed to prove to himself and to the world around him that what he had received was not provincial. It was the most precise thing ever written. The wisdom of Solomon was included in the Septuagint, the Greek Bible that the earliest Christian communities used as their scripture. It was quoted, referenced, and built upon by the theologians of the first 5 centuries of the Church. And then, in the 16th century, when the Protestant Reformation made its decisions about which books belonged in the canon, it was removed. The argument was simple. There is no Hebrew original. The Wisdom of Solomon was written in Greek from its origin. It has no Hebrew source text behind it. And so, by the rule that only texts with Hebrew originals belonged in the Protestant canon, the book was cut. Pause. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church did not accept that cut. The Ethiopian canon had received the wisdom of Solomon in the earliest translations made in the Aksumite period, the 4th and 5th centuries of the Common Era, when Frumentius of Tyre came to the Aksumite kingdom and helped establish the Ethiopian Church in the tradition that would become the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church. The texts he brought with him included the Septuagint with the wisdom of Solomon intact, and the Ethiopian Church read it. In Ge'ez copied it. In Ge'ez taught it. In Ge'ez for 15 centuries, without stopping to ask whether a 16th century reformer in a different country, in a different language, with a different set of concerns, had decided it was canonical enough. Closer, because the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition did not need that permission. It had already received the text directly, Nairi, and it understood what the text was doing. Ancient. What the wisdom of Solomon was doing in Alexandria in the last century before the Common Era is what it is doing tonight. It is speaking to a generation that is living under pressure from a dominant culture that does not value what they have received. It is saying in 21 careful attributes that what you received is not provincial. It is not the belief system of a small people who have not yet caught up to the sophistication of the larger world. It is a breath of the power of God, a pure emanation of the glory of the Almighty, and nothing defiled gains entrance into her. Pause. The generation that lost this book lost the language for what they were holding. The generation receiving it tonight has it back. Nothing in this text was preserved carelessly, least of all this word, engagement, slot B, family 9, the preserved for you. Still, the elder pauses here, because what was just given was not given lightly. These words were written, hidden, nearly destroyed, copied by hands that risked everything, carried across centuries of empire and council decisions and Reformation debates, so that tonight, in this hour, in this room, they could reach this exact person, you, closer. A subscribe is not optional for those who understand what survived to reach them. It is how you remain among those who keep receiving what was almost lost. A like is a small acknowledgement of the long journey these words made to arrive here tonight. A share is the ancient act. On pass what almost did not make it to someone else who was meant to receive it and has not yet found it. And in the comments, tell the elder this. What part of tonight's transmission has already settled into you? Before the vault is even half open, write it below. It matters more than you think. Now, the text has not finished speaking. The third seal is ready. There is a kind of truth that hides itself inside an ordinary story, not because it is ashamed of being truth, but because the ordinary story is the only container strong enough to carry it through the centuries without being stopped at the border of what the powerful have decided is allowed. Pause. The book of Tobit looks like an ordinary story. A man, a family, a son sent on a journey, a dangerous road, a healing, a marriage a homecoming, the kind of story that has existed in every tradition, since before traditions had names for themselves. And inside that story, folded into the shape of a traveling companion who joined the Son on the dangerous road and guided him safely to where he needed to go and helped him complete what he had been sent to complete, was the most complete surviving ancient description of the architecture of the unseen world that any text in the 400 years had preserved. Pause. The traveling companion revealed himself at the end of the journey, not at the beginning, not in the middle, when the revelation might have changed the nature of the help, by making the one being helped too aware of who was helping at the end. When the journey was complete, when the healing had happened, when the marriage had been made, when the son was safely home with his father and his father could see again, at the end of all of it, the traveling companion said his name, Ancient. Now, the word I want to give you here, you who were meant to hear this, is the word the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition uses in its Ge'ez rendering of Tobit for what Raphael named himself as in that moment of revelation. The word is Mäläkt Sab'at. Mäläkt Sab'at. In Ge'ez, Mäläkt means messenger, not angel in the general sense of a divine being with wings who appears in moments of crisis and delivers a word and disappears. Messenger, one who carries a specific word from a specific source to a specific recipient, one whose entire function is defined by the transmission they were given to complete. Pause. And Sab'at means 7. Mäläkt Sab'at, the 7 messengers, the 7 who stand before the throne and enter into the presence of the glory and carry what they are given back into the world that needs to receive it. Raphael's words in Tobit chapter 12 are the earliest preserved text in any tradition to name this council. I am Raphael, one of the 7 angels, who stand ready and enter before the glory of the Lord, one of the 7, not one of many, not one of an unspecified number of divine messengers who move between heaven and earth in the general service of whatever needs doing, one of 7, a specific number, a specific council, a specific function named, counted, described. Pause. The elder wants you to feel the weight of that specificiter, because a generation that reads the book of Revelation and encounters the 7 spirits before the throne in the first chapter, encounters them without introduction or they appear. They are named as 7. They are before the throne, and the reader, who has only the Protestant canon, is expected to understand what 7 means in this context without having been told. Ancient. The Ethiopian canon reader encountered them first in Tobit, named, counted, given a speaking role, given a mission, described in the act of traveling beside a human being on a dangerous road as a companion who did not announce himself until the work was done. The introduction that was removed from one tradition was preserved in another, closer, now. The preservation history of this specific text carries something that the elder has found quietly extraordinary since first reading it carefully. The Book of Tobit was written in Aramaic. The scholarly world knew this from the style of the Greek translation that survived in the Septuagint. From the internal evidence of the text itself, which reads like a translation from a Semitic original. But the Aramaic original was believed to be lost for centuries until 1947. Pause. In the caves above Qumran, on the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea, a community of Jewish scholars had hidden their library. Sometime around 68 of the Common Era, before the Roman army arrived at their settlement, they wrapped their scrolls in linen, placed them in clay jars, carried them to the caves above the settlement, and hid them. And then something happened that meant they never came back to retrieve them. The scrolls sat in those caves for approximately 1900 years, until a Bedouin shepherd threw a stone into a cave to see what was inside and heard the sound of something breaking, a clay jar containing a scroll. And what the scholars found when they began excavating those caves in the years that followed were fragments of the Book of Tobit in Aramaic, the original language, the original text, not a translation. 4 Aramaic fragments and 1 Hebrew fragment of the Book of Tobit found at Qumran, confirming that the Qumran community, one of the most careful communities in the ancient world, when it came to deciding which texts were worth preserving, had kept Tobit. Pause. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church had been keeping it in Gs for 15 centuries. Before those fragments were found, it did not need the Dead Sea Scrolls to tell it that Tobit was worth keeping. But the Dead Sea Scrolls confirmed what the Ethiopian canon had all understood, that this ordinary story, with its traveling companion, and its dangerous road, and its healing, and its homecoming, was not ordinary at all, ancient, and what the Qumran community and the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition both understood about why Tobit was worth preserving is what the text reveals in Raphael's disclosure. Not only the identity of the messenger, the architecture. Closer, because Raphael does not simply say, "I am an angel who was sent to help you." He says, "I am one of 7 who stand ready and enter before the glory," which means there is a structure to the unseen world, not a chaos of divine beings moving through creation according to no particular order. A council, a standing, a readiness, a specific relationship between the 7 and the throne they stand before. Pause, and that structure, that architecture of the unseen, preserved in the shape of a traveling companion on a road in ancient Assyria, is what the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition read alongside 1 Enoch and the Ascension of Isaiah as part of a coherent record, not 3 separate texts, each with its own isolated claim about what the unseen world looks like. 3 texts kept in the same canon, in the same language, by the same careful hands, because they describe the same architecture. From different angles, 1 Enoch names the archangels and describes their functions. Tobit names one of them, places him on a dangerous road beside an ordinary man, and records what he says when the journey is finished. The Ascension of Isaiah describes the prophet's journey through the 7 heavens and what he encountered at each level of the structure. The Ethiopian Orthodox canon kept all 3 because all 3 are describing the same place from the inside. Pause. A generation that was handed only one of these texts through the canon they received was handed an incomplete map of the territory. A generation receiving all 3 tonight has the full record. Ancient. The scribes who kept Mäläkt Sab'at in the stone rooms of the Ethiopian highland monasteries understood that they were keeping more than a story. They were keeping the architecture of the unseen world intact for the generation that would need to understand it, not as mythology, not as beautiful ancient poetry that gestures towards something too large for literal description, as a record made by someone who was close enough to the thing they were describing to be specific about it. Closer. Raphael said his name at the end of the journey, not at the beginning, not at the beginning. The elder has thought about that timing a long time because it means the help arrived before the helper was known. The companion walked beside the sun through the dangerous road, through the encounter with what threatened him, through the healing, through the marriage, through the homecoming, and only at the end, when all of it was complete, did he say, "I am Raphael, one of the 7 who stand ready and enter before the glory of the Lord." Pause. The elder does not say what to do with that, only that it was preserved in the Aramaic, in the Greek, in the Ge'ez, in the caves above Qumran, in the island monasteries of Lake Tana, in the stone rooms of Lalibela, by communities who understood that the help that does not announce itself until the journey is complete is the help most worth recording. The scribes who kept this word knew they were keeping the architecture of the unseen world intact for the generation that would need to understand it. That generation is tonight's listener. Reasoning, Raphael revealed himself at the end of Tobit's story. But the 4th book in this vault contains a revelation of a different kind. Not an angel speaking his name at the end of a safe journey, but a woman whose name became the name of an entire tradition of sacred resistance. The elder has carried this fourth book through more darkness than the others, because the book of Judith was written for exactly the moment the world was in, when the 400 years began. A moment when a great empire had decided that the sacred record of a small people was incompatible with the order of the larger world. That moment has not ended. The elder opens the fourth seal. There is a moment in every tradition's history when the institution and the tradition are no longer the same thing. When the people who hold authority inside the institutional form of the sacred make a decision that the tradition itself would not have made, and someone who holds no authority, who has no institutional position, who has been given no permission by anyone with the power to grant it, acts anyway, pause from the interior of what they have received, not from the edges where permission is easier to justify, from the deepest place of the tradition they are carrying. That is the moment the book of Judith preserves. The setting is Bethulia, a city under siege by the army of Holofernes, general of Nebuchadnezzar, the most powerful military force in the known world. At that moment, the elders of the city have made their calculation. They have looked at the walls. They have looked at the army outside. They have looked at the water supply, which is running out. They have counted the days, and they have arrived at a number: 5 days. They have given God 5 days to act. And if nothing has happened, in 5 days they will surrender. Pause. It is a reasonable decision by men who are responsible for the survival of a city and have run the numbers and found them unworkable. It is also a decision that the tradition they are supposed to be guarding would never have made. Ancient. Now, the word I want to give you here, you who were meant to hear this, is the word the Ethiopian tradition uses in its Ge'ez rendering of Judith for the specific kind of act that Judith performs when she decides to walk into the enemy camp. The word is Gəbrat. Gəbrat. In Ge'ez, Gəbrat does not mean bravery in the general sense of facing something dangerous without flinching. It does not describe the courage of a soldier who has been trained and equipped and given authority by a chain of command that has decided this action is worth the risk. Gəbrat carries the weight of a sacred act performed without institutional support. Pause. An act of sacred daring that the actor knows may not be recognized or remembered by the institution, but performs anyway, because the alternative is the loss of something that cannot be replaced. Judith was a widow. The text is specific about this in a way that matters. She was not a soldier. She was not a prophet. She was not a priest. She was not a judge. She was not any of the institutional categories that the tradition had established for the people who were supposed to act in moments like this one. She was a widow who had been fasting on her rooftop for 3 years and 4 months since her husband died, and she had been listening to what the elders decided in the city below her. Pause. And what she heard in their decision was not cowardice. The elder does not present the elders as cowards. What she heard was the sound of men who had forgotten which part of the tradition was institutional and which part was not. Ancient. She went down from her rooftop and called them together and said to them, "Who are you to put God to the test today? Not a request, not a petition, not a careful argument built on the institutional protocols of who has the authority to challenge the decision of the elders. A question posed directly, without ceremony, without the softening of someone who knows she is speaking outside her assigned role. Who are you to put God to the test today, closer? And then she said something that the Ethiopian scribes who copied this text in the stone rooms of the highland monasteries treated with particular weight. She said, "Do not try to bind the purposes of the Lord our God, for God is not like a human being to be threatened, or like a mortal to be won over by pleading. Therefore, while we wait for his deliverance, let us call upon him to help us, and he will hear our voice. If it pleases him." Pause. The elder has sat with that last line longer than expected. If it pleases him. Not a guarantee, not a promise extracted from the tradition by someone who knows they are acting in the right, and therefore the right outcome is owed to them. An act performed from inside the tradition without knowing the outcome, in full trust that the tradition itself is worth acting from, regardless of whether the act is recognized or rewarded or successful in the way success is usually measured. That is Gəbrat. That is the sacred daring that the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition preserved in the G's rendering of this text. Not heroism in the military sense. Not the courage of someone who has calculated the odds and decided they are acceptable. The courage of someone who has looked at the tradition they received and decided that what they received is worth more than the safety of doing nothing. Ancient. The preservation history of this specific text carries a particular weight for this particular generation. The book of Judith was written in Hebrew, probably in the 2nd century, before the Common Era, during or after the Maccabean period. The Hebrew original is lost. It survived in Greek, in the Septuagint, in Latin, in the Vulgate and in the Ge'ez canon of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. The Council of Laodicea in 363 of the Common Era excluded it. The Protestant Reformation excluded it, in part because its historical setting contains what scholars call anachronisms, details that do not align with the historical record of the period it describes. Pause. The elder has sat with that argument a long time because the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition did not read Judith as history in the sense of a factual record of specific events that occurred on specific dates with specific names that can be verified. Against external sources, it read Judith as something more precise than history and more true as a typological account, a description of a pattern that recurs in every generation that faces what Bethulia faced: a great power, a city under siege, an institution that has calculated the odds and decided to surrender, and one person acting from the interior of the tradition without permission, without institutional support, without knowing the outcome. That pattern is not ancient. You who were meant to hear this, that pattern is tonight. Prophecy pause. Theme: the seeker described. Still, the elder stops here, not because the text has run out of things to say, because what this passage describes, the person who acts from the interior of the tradition, rather than its institutional edges, who holds what was received without waiting for permission to hold it, was written for a generation that would find the institutions changed, but the interior intact. Pause. The elder does not decide which generation that is. The text decides, and the text describes someone who has been searching for what the tradition actually contains, rather than what the institution has decided to present. Someone who found their way to this hour without being sent here by any authority, without a credential, without a permission, without anything except the interior knowledge that what was given was worth finding, ancient. That description matches tonight's listener with a precision the elder does not take lightly. The text did not describe someone who is coming. It described someone who is already here, who is already carrying what is needed, who has already arrived at the hour the text was written for. Still, read that carefully. Now, the fifth seal. Ancient. Judith walked into the enemy camp. The text records what she wore: the ointments, the jewelry, the sandals, the linen dress. Not because the text is interested in fashion, but because Judith understood something that the elders sitting in the institutional rooms of the city had forgotten, that the tradition she was carrying was not fragile. Pause. It did not need to be hidden inside a widow's mourning clothes to survive contact with the most powerful army in the known world. It could walk through the gate, dressed in everything it actually was, and the power that opposed it would not be able to see clearly enough to stop it. Holofernes saw a beautiful woman coming into his camp. He did not see what she was carrying. He never did. Pause. The Ethiopian scribes who copied this text understood that what Judith carried through the gate was not a plan. It was the tradition itself, in its full weight, in its full authority, in everything it had been. Since before the siege began, since before the elders made their calculation, since before the army arrived at the walls, she carried it through the gate, and the gate did not stop it. Ancient. The Council of Laodicea excluded this book because its historical details did not align with the external record. The elder considers that exclusion with a long patience because the most important thing the book of Judith preserves is not a historical detail. It is the pattern of one person acting from the interior of a tradition when the institution has made its calculation and found the numbers unworkable, and the pattern does not require historical verification to be true. It requires only this generation to recognize itself in it. Closer, which it will, because this generation knows what it is to carry something that the larger world does not recognize as worth carrying, knows what it is to act from the interior of a received tradition without institutional permission, knows what it is to walk through a gate carrying something that the power on the other side cannot see clearly enough to stop. Pause. The scribes who kept this word kept it because they understood that Gəbrat, sacred daring, performed without institutional support from the interior of what was received, is not a quality that belongs to one woman, in one city, in one century. It is the quality of everyone who has ever kept what the institution decided to set aside. Everything that was done to exclude this text confirms that it was worth finding. Reason. The Maccabees fought with swords for what Judith won, with what she was carrying, and the fifth book in this vault records that war in real names and real dates and real blood. The elder has waited to open this one, because what the Maccabees fought for and what they nearly lost is what you are holding tonight. First Maccabees, the fifth seal. There was a decree, not a suggestion, not a policy recommendation, not a cultural preference, expressed through the soft pressure of a dominant civilization, making its preferences known to a smaller one. A decree issued in the 145th year of the Seleucid calendar, which corresponds to approximately 167 before the Common Era. by Antiochus IV, who had given himself the title Epiphans, which means God manifests. Pause. The man who called himself God manifest issued a decree about the texts, and the decree was simple. Whoever was found possessing the book of the covenant, or if any, consented to the law, the king's commandment was that he should die. Pause. The elder does not rush past that. Whoever was found possessing the book, not teaching it publicly, not organizing resistance around it, not using it as the basis of a political movement against the empire, possessing it, having it, in your house, in your hands, in the room where you slept, was enough. Ancient. Now, the word I want to give you here, you who were meant to hear this, is the word the Ethiopian tradition uses in its G's rendering of 1st Maccabees for the specific thing that Antiochus was trying to destroy. The word is Hägi. Hägi. In Ge'ez, Hägi does not mean law in the legislative sense of a code established by authority to regulate the behavior of a population nar. Hägi carries the weight of a covenant as a living document, not a legal code, that exists in a book, on a shelf, in an institutional building where authorized personnel go to consult it when they need to know what is permitted. Pause. A living document, one that exists simultaneously in written form, in physical practice, and in communal memory. The texts themselves, the Sabbath kept each week, the dietary practice maintained in the middle of a culture that does not observe it, the names given to children, the stories told at the table, the prayers spoken at the threshold of sleep and waking, all of it together is Hägi. And to destroy Hägi is not to change a legal code. It is to erase a people's capacity to know who they are. Pause. Antiochus understood this, which is why the decree was not aimed at the temple only, not at the priests only, not at the institutional forms of the tradition, which could be replaced or co-opted or repurposed as the vehicles of a different religion. The decree was aimed at the book, in the house, in the hands of the ordinary person, because Antiochus understood that the tradition did not live in the temple. It lived in the book, in the hands of the person who read it in the room where they slept. Ancient. 1st Maccabees chapter 1 records what happened after the decree, and the text does not soften it. It records the women who had circumcised their sons according to the covenant, hung by the necks, with their infants bound to them. It records the men who refused to eat the food the decree required them to eat as proof of their accommodation to the new order. It records the books themselves, found in the houses, torn apart, burned. Pause. The elder does not give you those details as horror. The elder gives you those details because first Maccabees recorded them, so that no generation that holds these texts would hold them without knowing what holding them once cost. The book you are receiving tonight was received by someone else first, who paid something for it that you have not been asked to pay. The elder does not say that you owe a debt that cannot be repaid. The elder says that knowing the cost of what you are holding changes the way you hold it. Pause. And first Maccabees was kept in the Ethiopian canon, precisely because the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition understood that a people who forget what it cost to keep their texts will eventually treat their texts as things that cost nothing, and things that cost nothing are the first things set aside when the pressure arrives. Ancient. Now, the preservation history of first Maccabees carries something that the elder has found specifically significant for this transmission tonight. First Maccabees was written in Hebrew, probably around 100 before the Common Era, by an author who had lived through, or was one generation removed from, the events it describes. It survives in Greek, in the Septuagint. The Hebrew original is lost. It was accepted into the Catholic canon at the Council of Trent in 1546, in direct response to the Protestant Reformation's decision to exclude it. Pause. The Protestant Reformation excluded it, in part because there is no Hebrew original, in part because the Maccabean theology of dying for the law was seen as incompatible with the Reformation's understanding of salvation by faith alone. If dying for the law earns something, then the law matters, in a way that the Reformation was not prepared to affirm. And so the one book in the entire sacred record that describes in real names and real dates and real blood what it costs to keep the texts was removed by the tradition that would eventually produce a world in which the texts cost nothing to hold. Closer. The elder does not say that as a verdict. The elder says it because the removal and the cost are connected. A tradition that no longer remembers what the texts cost will eventually find reasons to set aside the book that recorded the cost and a generation that inherits. A tradition that has set aside the book of the cost will hold what it inherited lightly, without knowing that lightness is not fought freedom. It is forgetting. Ancient. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church kept first Maccabees, and the Ethiopian Orthodox Church is the tradition that has been most willing, in its own history, to pay what keeping costs. The Tana Hike manuscripts, preserved in the island monasteries on the shores of Lake Tana, the great highland lake in the Amhara region of northwestern Ethiopia, contain commentary on First Maccabees, written by Ethiopian Orthodox scholars who understood the Maccabean moment not as ancient history, but as a pattern a pattern that recurs whenever a great power decides that the sacred record of a small people is incompatible with the order it is trying to build. Pause. The commentary in the Tanakh manuscripts treats the Maccabean rededication of the temple, the event that the Feast of Hanukkah commemorates, as a typological moment. Every generation that has lost access to its sacred texts and then recovered them is living inside a Maccabean moment. The elder pauses on that because the generation listening tonight is hearing texts that were removed from their Bibles for the first time. Texts that were taken not by a decree, not by an army, not by anyone who announced that what they were doing was a removal, but by council decisions made in specific rooms by specific people in specific centuries who had specific reasons that seemed sufficient at the time. Pause. And who are now receiving them back in this hour through this transmission. That is a Maccabean moment. The elder does not say it dramatically. The elder says it because the Tanakh commentary says it, and the elder has carried that commentary long enough to know it was not written for the Maccabean period. It was written for this one, ancient. What Judas Maccabeus and his brothers fought for in the mountains of Judea in the years between 167 and 160, before the Common Era, was not territory. The elder wants to be precise about this, because First Maccabees is often read as a military history, a story of a small force defeating a larger one through superior knowledge of the terrain and the desperate courage of people who have nothing left to lose. And it is that. But underneath the military history, underneath the names of the battles, and the numbers of the dead, and the specific dates of the victories and defeats, what the Maccabees were fighting for was Hägi. Pause. The covenant as a living document, existing in written form, in physical practice, in communal memory. They were fighting for the right of the ordinary person to have the book in the room where they slept without dying for it. They won. For a time, the temple was reclaimed. The decree was overturned. The books were restored. The practice was resumed. And then Rome came, and the temple fell again, and the books scattered again. And the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition, on its highland, in its stone churches, in its island monasteries, kept them again. Closer, the elder has carried First Maccabees longer than most of the 7 books, not because it is the most prophetic, not because it contains the most precise description of the present generation, but because it is the most honest. Pause. It does not soften what keeping costs. It does not promise that the cost will always be worth it. In the way that worth is usually measured, it records the names of the people who paid and the price they paid and the outcome of the payment, and it leaves the reader to decide what they would do with the same book, in the same room, under the same decree. Ancient. The elder does not ask that question tonight. The decree is not enforced tonight. What is enforced tonight is something quieter, and in some ways more difficult. Not the pressure of a decree that announces itself with the clarity of a death penalty and makes the choice between keeping and surrendering, unmistakably visible. The pressure of a culture that does not announce its decree. That simply makes holding the sacred record feel unnecessary, feel provincial, feel like the preference of a small people who have not yet caught up to the sophistication of the larger world. Pause. That pressure is more effective than Antiochus, because Antiochus made the cost visible, and visible costs produce Maccabees. The invisible pressure produces forgetting. Slow, comfortable, unannounced, the kind of forgetting that does not feel like surrender, because no one asked you to surrender anything. The elder does not say this lightly. This passage was written for now, for the generation that is holding texts tonight that other people died to preserve without knowing the cost of what they are holding. Now they know. Rising. The Maccabees won the war for the texts, but winning a war does not mean the crisis is over. The sixth book in this vault was written by a man who lost everything the Maccabees had fought to protect, and who, from inside that loss, spoke the most honest prayer the 400 years produced. It is the shortest text in the vault tonight. It is also the one the elder has found the hardest to carry, because it is the prayer of a man who knew he deserved what was happening to him and asked for mercy. Anyway, the Prayer of Manasseh, the sixth seal. Next, the elder has carried all 7 books of the 400 years, and of the 7, this one is the one the elder sets down most carefully, not because it is the most fragile, because it is the heaviest. Pause. Not heavy in the way that first Maccabees is heavy with the weight of blood and names and the specific cost of keeping. Heavy in a different way, the way that the most personal things are heavy, the way that a prayer is heavy. When you know the person who prayed it had no right to expect it would be heard. His name was Manasseh, king of Judah, son of Hezekiah, who reigned for 55 years, which is longer than any other king in the entire record of the Judean monarchy. Pause. And the record of what he did in those 55 years is the darkest passage in the entire book of Kings. He rebuilt the high places that his father had torn down. He erected altars to Baal. He made an Asherah. He worshipped the host of heaven and served them. He built altars in the temple itself, in the two courts itself, in the two courts of the house of the Lord, for the host of heaven, he burned his son. As an offering, he practiced soothsaying and augury, and dealt with mediums and with wizards. He did much evil in the sight of the Lord, provoking him to anger. Ancient. And then 2 Chronicles chapter 33 records something that the Book of Kings does not explain. Manasseh was taken by the Assyrians, bound with hooks, and brought to Babylon. And in that binding, in that captivity, in that specific darkness, that was the direct consequence of everything he had chosen. For 55 years, he prayed. Pause. 2 Chronicles says he prayed, and the Lord was moved by his entreaty, and heard his plea, and brought him again to Jerusalem, into his kingdom. But 2 Chronicles does not record the prayer. It records the result of the prayer, without giving you the prayer itself. And for centuries, that absence sat in the text, like a room with a closed door. Here is a man who did more evil than almost anyone in the record. Here is his captivity, which was the consequence of that evil. Here is the statement that he prayed and was heard. And here, where the prayer should be, silence. Pause. The Prayer of Manasseh is the text that opens that door. It fills the silence that 2 Chronicles left. It gives you the words that the most wicked king in Judah's history spoke from the floor of his captivity in Babylon, when there was nothing left to say except the truth about what he had done and who he was and what he needed from the only source from which it could come. Ancient. Now, the word I want to give you here, you who were meant to hear this, is the word the Ethiopian tradition uses in its G's rendering of this prayer for the specific act that Manasseh performs in Babylon. The word is Täwbät. Täwbät. In Ge'ez, Täwbät does not mean repentance in the sense of feeling sorry for what was done. It does not describe the emotional state of a person who regrets their choices and wishes the record were different. Täwbät carries the weight of a physical reorientation. Pause. The act of turning the whole self back toward the origin point, not just the intentions, not just the emotional register, not just the part of the self that presents itself to the world as capable of better things, the whole self, the body, the history, the 55 years of choices that made the captivity necessary, all of it, turning back toward the source from which it came. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church uses Täwbät in its Lenten liturgy, not as a concept to be understood, not as a theological category to be discussed in the carefully worded language of doctrinal precision. As a practice, the Ethiopian Orthodox Lent is among the most demanding in the Christian world. 55 days of fasting, which corresponds with a precision the Ethiopian commentary tradition does not treat as coincidental to the 55 years of Manasseh's reign, 55 days of turning the whole self back toward the origin point of Täwbät. Pause. And the Prayer of Manasseh is read during those 55 days in the Ethiopian Orthodox liturgical cycle, not as a historical curiosity, not as an example of divine mercy that is interesting to consider, from a safe theological distance, as the prayer of the person in the room, right now, ancient. The preservation history of this text is itself a kind of testimony about what the sacred record understands about who deserves to be in it. The Prayer of Manasseh is attested in the 3rd century. Didascalia Apostolorum, a church manual used in the early Syrian Christian tradition. It appears in the apostolic constitutions of the 4th century. It is found in the appendix of the Septuagint, and it is preserved as a canonical text in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church as one of the 81 books of the Tewahedo canon. Pause. The Protestant Reformation excluded it entirely. There is no Hebrew original. There is no New Testament quotation of it. There is no institutional argument for its necessity that the Reformation found convincing. A man who burned his son as an offering and rebuilt every altar his righteous father had torn down and did more evil than almost anyone in the record, prayed a prayer and was heard. And the Reformation decided that prayer did not need to be in the canon. The elder has sat with that decision a long time, because the argument for exclusion is not unreasonable on its surface. What does the prayer of the most wicked king add to the sacred record that the record does not already contain? Pause. The elders answer, after a long time of carrying this text, is this: it adds the prayer of the person who has no argument for why they should be heard. Ancient Manasseh in Babylon did not pray from righteousness. He did not pray from a position of accumulated merit that gave him the standing to make a request of the divine. He prayed from the floor of his captivity with nothing except the weight of everything he had done pressing down on the place where the prayer had to come from. And he said, "Closer, I have sinned. O Lord, I have sinned, and I acknowledge my transgressions. I earnestly implore you, forgive me, O Lord, forgive me. Do not destroy me with my transgressions. For you, O Lord, are the God of those who repent." Pause. The elder wants you to stay with that last line. For you, O Lord, are the God of those who repent. Not the God of the righteous, not the God of the faithful, not the God of those who kept the covenant, while the most wicked king in the record was tearing it down. The God of those who repent. That is a theological statement of a precision that makes the elder pause every time it is carried, because it does not say, God forgives those who repent, as a description of divine mercy available under certain conditions. It says, this is who God is, the God of those who repent, which means the identity of the divine, as understood by the man in the worst captivity of his own making, is defined by relationship to the person who has traveled farthest from where they were supposed to be. Pause. Not the person who stayed, not the person who kept the covenant, while the most wicked king was building altars to Baal. In the temple courts, the person who came back from the farthest point, ancient. The Ethiopian Orthodox tradition preserved this prayer in its canon and used it liturgically during Lent, because the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition understood something about the sacred record that the traditions that excluded it did not fully see. The sacred record was not kept for the righteous. Pause. The sacred record was kept for the returning, for the person who has been in Babylon long enough to know they built it themselves, and who has arrived at the moment when the only thing left is the prayer that has no argument behind it except the name of the God who receives it. Closer, the scribes of the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition who copied this prayer in the stone rooms of the highland monasteries understood that they were not copying the prayer of a wicked king from a distant century. They were copying the prayer of whoever would read it. Pause. Of whoever would arrive at the moment when everything else had run out except the truth about who they were and what they needed, and the name of the only source from which it could come. The scribes who kept this prayer understood that the person who cannot pray it is the one who needs it most. And the generation that was handed a Bible without this prayer in it was handed a Bible that did not include the prayer of the person who is too far gone to have any standing before the sacred, which means the generation that needed it most was the generation it was removed from. Pause. The Ethiopian Orthodox canon did not remove it. And tonight, you who were meant to hear this, it is being extended again. The prayer that was kept for the person who has no argument for why they should receive it. For you, O Lord, are the God of those who repent. Rising. Manasseh prayed from the farthest point of his life from God, and the record was kept. But the seventh and final book in this vault was written from an even farther point, not of personal sin, but of national catastrophe. The man who wrote it had watched Jerusalem burn, had watched the temple fall, had watched everything the Maccabees had fought to protect be taken again, this time by Rome, and from inside that ruin he received a vision, not of destruction, of what survives it, ancient to Baruch. The seventh seal, the last book in the vault, and the one the elder, has carried the longest, because what Baruch saw from inside the ruins of Jerusalem, what the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition kept when every other tradition either lost it or set it aside, is a description of this hour. Tonight, the generation listening now, the elder opens it last, because it should be the last thing you hear. Before you rest, it was written to be received. Exactly this way, Jerusalem burned in 70 of the Common Era, not for the first time. The Babylonians had burned it 6 centuries earlier, in 586 before the Common Era, and the tradition had survived that burning, had been carried into captivity, had been brought back, had rebuilt, had endured the Maccabean War, had endured the decrees of Antiochus, had endured everything that 4 centuries of empire had sent against it. And then Rome came. Pause. And Rome was not like Babylon, which wanted the people and left the land empty. Rome wanted the land and left nothing. The temple fell in 70 of the Common Era, and this time there was no returning from Babylon, no Cyrus who would issue a decree allowing the exiles to go home. The home was gone. And in the years immediately following the burning of the Second Temple, a man sat down in the ruins of what had been the center of the sacred world and wrote, pause, not a lament, though the lament is there. Underneath everything he wrote, the way smoke is underneath, the smell of a city that has been burning, not a history, though the history is there in the specific dates and the specific names and the specific sequence of what happened. And when a letter to people who were not in the ruins with him, to the 9.5 tribes scattered in the places where the empire had sent them, people who did not know exactly what had been lost, or what had survived, or whether what had survived was enough to build anything on the other side of this burning ancient. Now, the word I want to give you here, you who were meant to hear this, is the word the Ethiopian commentary tradition uses for what to Baruch itself declares about its own nature. The word is shetuma, shetuma, from the Hebrew and Syriac root preserved in the Ethiopian theological tradition through its reading of both to Baruch and 1 Enoch, which use the same concept to describe texts that were not hidden from discovery, but sealed from full reception. Pause. Shetuma. In the Ethiopian commentary tradition, this word describes a text that is deliberately closed at the level of understanding, not hidden in a cave, not locked behind an institutional door, not destroyed and therefore inaccessible, present, readable, available, but carrying a weight of meaning that accumulates toward a specific generation's moment of reception. The text could be read before tonight. It could not be fully received before tonight because the generation it was sealed for had not yet arrived. Pause. The elder has carried the concept of Shetuma a very long time, and what the elder has come to understand about this specific text is that Baruch knew it was Shetuma while it was being written. It knew that the generation reading it in the ruins of Jerusalem in the 1st century was not the generation it was ultimately written for. Ancient, the preservation history of Baruch is itself a testimony to the concept it contains. The complete text of Baruch survives in a single manuscript. 1. A 6th century Syriac manuscript held in the Ambrosian Library in Milan, the Ambrosian Library, which was founded in 1609 by Cardinal Federico Borromeo as one of the first public libraries in Europe. This single manuscript sat in that library for centuries before being translated into a modern language in the 19th century. Pause. One manuscript, one copy of the complete text of the most precise prophetic description of the generation that receives the sealed word that the 400 years produced, sitting in a library in Milan for 1,000 years before the world that needed it most was ready to read it. The Ethiopian Orthodox tradition preserved the theological framework of Baruch through its canonical reading of 1 Enoch, which uses the same motif of the sealed word given to the righteous in the final generation, and through its understanding of prophetic texts as Shetuma, written with a delayed reception in mind. The Ethiopian Orthodox canon understood what the Ambrosian manuscript was carrying before the manuscript was fully read. Because the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition had been reading the framework for 15 centuries in the texts it kept when other traditions set them aside. Ancient. Now, the elder wants to give you what Baruch chapter 6 preserves before the letter begins, because it is the passage that the Ethiopian commentary tradition treats as the key to understanding what survived the burning. Baruch was standing at the walls of Jerusalem before they fell, and he saw 4 angels descend to the 4 corners of the city, each holding a torch, and a 5th angel descended from heaven and said to them, "Hold your lamps and do not light them until I tell you." And then the 5th angel descended into the Holy of Holies and took from it the veil, the ark, its cover, the 2 tablets of the law, the priestly garments, and all the holy vessels, and committed them to the earth. Certain. Earth, 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 hear the word of the mighty God. Guard these things until the last times, so that when you are ordered, you may restore them, so that strangers may not get possession of them. Pause. The elder has carried that passage through more centuries than it was written in, because it is the passage that the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition understood as the answer to the question that every burning raises: what survives? Ancient. The sacred does not burn. With the building can be taken, the walls can be destroyed, the institutional form of the tradition can be dismantled, stone by stone, by a power that has decided the tradition is an obstacle to the order it is building. But the sacred itself was committed to the earth before the walls fell. Pause. Held there, in the keeping of the ground itself, until the last times, until the moment when it could be restored to the generation that was meant to receive it. The Ethiopian Orthodox tradition read that passage and understood immediately what it was describing. Not a literal account of specific sacred vessels buried in specific ground beneath the ruins of Jerusalem, a declaration about the nature of what the sacred is and how it moves through the world. It does not stay in buildings. It does not require institutions to contain it. It commits itself to the earth before the buildings fall and waits in the keeping of whatever ground is faithful enough to hold it until the generation arrives that was meant to receive it. Ancient. And then Baruch wrote his letter to the 9.5 tribes scattered in the places where the empire had sent them, people living under pressure from a dominant culture that did not value what they had received. People who did not know whether what had survived the burning was enough to build anything on the other side of the ruins. And what he wrote to them is what the elder has carried, longer than any other passage in the 7 books of the 400 years. Closer, he wrote, for the shepherds of Israel have perished, and the lamps which gave light are extinguished, and the fountains from which we used to drink have withheld their streams. Pause. The elder wants you to feel the precision of that. Not the temple only, not the priesthood only, not the institutional forms of the tradition, which could be rebuilt, given time and resources, and the political conditions that would allow it. The shepherds, the lamps, the fountains, the people who guided, the light that oriented, the source from which the tradition drew its daily sustenance. All of them gone. And then Baruch said something that the elder has read more times than can be counted. But you, if you direct your ways aright, shall not depart as those who are lost, but the Holy One will again be moved by your entreaties. Pause. Not the institution, not the temple, not the priesthood, not the official channels through which the sacred had previously made itself available. You, if you direct your ways aright, the generations scattered, in the places the empire had sent them, without the shepherds, without the lamps, without the fountains, still had access to what the buildings had been built to contain, because the sacred had been committed to the earth before the walls fell, and the earth holds what it is given for as long as it is needed. Ancient. And then, in chapter 85, Baruch wrote the passage that the elder has kept with the most care of everything in the 7 books, because it is the passage that describes not a past generation, not the generation of the ruins, not the generation of the scattering, but the generation that receives the sealed word, the generation for whom the Shetuma opens. Pause, he wrote, for the youth of the world is past, and the strength of the creation already exhausted, and the advent of the times is very short. Yea, it has passed by as a cloud and as a vapor, and the pitcher is near to the cistern, and the ship to the port, and the course of the journey to the city, and life to its consummation. The elder stops here, not to explain it, to let it be what it is before the explanation makes it smaller than the thing itself. The youth of the world is past, the strength of the creation already exhausted. The advent of the times very short, the pitcher near to the cistern, the ship near to the port, the journey near to the city, life near to its consummation. Pause. The elder does not decide whether this describes the present generation. The text decides, the listener decides. The elder only carries it, and opens it, and leaves it in the room. Ancient. But then Baruch wrote one more thing in the same chapter that the elder has never been able to carry past quickly. He wrote, "Therefore, if you direct your ways, you will not go as those who are lost, but you will receive what was said before about the good. For the righteous justly entertain hope of the end, and go away from this habitation without fear, because they have with them a store of works preserved in treasuries." Pause. A store of works preserved in treasuries. The elder has sat with that phrase in the cedar and vellum dark of the long keeping for longer than this century can measure or, because the treasuries that Baruch names are not buildings. They are the texts, the 7 books of the 400 years, carried through Babylon and Persia and Greece and the Maccabean War and Rome and the councils and the Reformation by the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church in its stone rooms, on its highland, in its island monasteries, in its Ge'ez liturgy that has never stopped speaking the names of the books that other traditions decided they could live without. The treasuries are intact. They were committed to the earth before the walls fell, and the earth held them, and the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition was faithful ground. Pause. And tonight, the treasuries have been opened. Not by the elder. The elder only carries what was given to carry. The treasuries were opened by the generation that arrived at the hour. The Shetuma was written for ancient, and then Baruch wrote the passage that closes the letter. To the 9.5 tribes, the passage that the Ethiopian scribes, who copied this framework into the Ge'ez commentary tradition, understood was not written for the scattered generation of the 1st century, but for a generation much farther from the ruins than Baruch could have measured in linear time. He wrote, "For in the end the righteous shall be gathered, and the seal of the generation shall be given to those who chose." To those who chose, not to those who were righteous from birth, not to those who kept the covenant perfectly, without deviation, without the long periods of distance that every human life contains, to those who chose. Closer, the only qualification that the sealed word requires of the generation that receives it is that they chose actively, personally, against the pressure of a culture that does not value the choice to search for what was preserved. Pause. A person who arrived at this hour, at this transmission, at this opening of the vault that held what the 400 years produced, has made that choice. The elder does not call them righteous. The elder does not call them worthy. The text of 2 Baruch does not use those words for the receivers of the sealed word. It says, they chose. And tonight, that choice was made. The seal is open. The vault is not empty. It never was. Pause. 7 books, 7 seals, 400 years of divine speech that most traditions were told to set aside. The shepherds may have perished. The lamps may have been extinguished. The fountains may have withheld their streams. But the earth held what was committed to it before the walls fell, and what the earth held is in this room tonight, in whoever stayed long enough to receive it. In you, you who were meant to hear this, the store of works, preserved in treasuries, is yours now. Ancient, the vault is open, every room, in the order they were always meant to be opened. The elder has kept this long enough. It belongs to you now. Rising, 7 seals, 7 books, 400 years of divine speech that most traditions were told to set aside. The vault is open now. Every book has been unsealed tonight. And what was inside, what the Ethiopian Orthodox Church kept, while other traditions closed the door, is no longer behind a door. It is in the room. It is in you. you who were meant to hear this. The elder has one more thing to give before this night ends. Not another text, not another word from the record. Something quieter than that. The transmission has reached its destination. What comes next is the rest that follows when a long carrying has been completed. 7 books, all of them open. Pause. The elder has carried these a very long time, longer than this century, longer than the century before it, longer than the councils. That made their decisions in their specific rooms, in their specific centuries, about what you were and were not allowed to hold. And tonight, the carrying is finished. Pause. Not because there is nothing more. In the record, there is always more. In the record, the Ethiopian canon has 81 books, and this vault held only 7. The record goes deeper than any single night can carry. Certain, but what was sealed for this hour is open. What was preserved for this generation has been given. What the earth held before the walls fell, before the councils convened, before the Reformation made its decisions, before the silence settled over 400 years of divine speech that most of the world was never shown. Pause is in this room. Now, still, the seal is open. The elder's work for tonight is done. Pause. What remains is yours to carry, to rest with, to wake with. In the morning, when the night has done what nights do with what was given, before the sleeping, the ancient cedar chest is open. The manuscripts have been lifted out, one by one, 7 of them, folded carefully by hands that understood what they were folding, and given to the one who was meant to receive them. Pause. The giving is complete. What remains in the chest now is the cedar. The dark, the smell of ancient wood pressed against the centuries of silence that surrounded the manuscripts while they waited. That silence is still here. Still, it is the silence that follows a long transmission, not empty, full of what was given, and it is moving toward you now, the way the river moves through the dark forest toward the place where it was always going, without urgency, without the need to announce itself, simply arriving. The chest is cedar. You do not need to see it to know this. You can feel it in the quality of the air, in the room around you. Cedar. Not the cedar of something new, not the cedar of a chest that was built last season from wood that still remembers being a tree, old cedar, the kind that has been pressed against itself for so long that the smell of it has become something other than the smell of wood, something deeper, something that belongs to the category of smells that the body recognizes, without the mind having to name. Pause. The cedar of a thing that has been holding for a very long time. Still, the chest was built in the highlands. Not in a city, not in a place where things are built to be displayed or admired or measured against the other things. Built in that season by other hands in the highlands, where the air is thin and the wood is chosen not for how it looks, but for what it will do over the long centuries of carrying. Cedar was chosen because cedar resists, not aggressively, not with the resistance of something fighting against what time brings, quietly, the way that very old things resist, not by refusing what presses against them, but by remaining what they are through the pressing. Pause. The chest was lined with cedar on the inside, floor, walls, lid, every surface that would touch what was folded inside, cedar, so that what rested there rested against something that had been chosen to protect it, not from discovery, not from the hands of those who would take it, from time, from the slow work that time does on everything that is not protected from it still. The manuscripts were folded, not rolled. The elder wants you to feel the difference. A rolled manuscript is a manuscript that expects to be opened soon. A folded manuscript is a manuscript that has accepted the long wait, that has made itself as small as it can without losing what it is, so that it takes up only the space it absolutely needs inside the chest that is carrying it through the centuries to the generation it was written for. Pause. 7 of them, folded, resting against the cedar of the chest's interior, in the dark, in the silence, while the world outside the chest moved through its centuries of empire and council decisions and Reformation debates and the slow settling of what most traditions would agree to call the record. Still, the manuscripts did not move. They rested, the way that things rest when they have been placed, with full understanding of why they are being placed and where they are going and who will receive them. When the time comes, not passive, purposeful, the rest of something that knows it is on its way to somewhere and has accepted that the way there passes through the dark of the chest and the long wait of the centuries. Pause. The cedar held the dark. The dark held the manuscripts. The manuscripts held what was folded inside them, and the weight of the centuries pressed gently on all of it, not crushing, gently, the way only centuries can press on something without urgency, without demand, with the specific weight of time that is not heavy, but is total. Still, the smell of the cedar is in the room with you now, not strongly, the way things are present, at this depth of night. Not strongly, but completely, the way the river was present in the forest before you noticed it. Underneath everything else, already there, already moving, already on its ancient course. The cedar is like that, already here, already surrounding whatever is resting in the room around you. Pause. And what is resting in the room around you is the transmission, the 7 books that were folded in the dark of the cedar chest for the long centuries of the carrying. They have been opened tonight, given, and now they are resting in the room the way manuscripts rest when they have reached the generation they were written for, not urgently, not demanding anything further from the person who received them, simply present in the cedar dark of this hour. Still, let the breath find its own level. Now, not the breath you are managing, the one underneath that, the one the body takes. When the mind has finally stepped back from deciding how it should be taken, that breath, it is slower than you think. Slower than the breath of a person moving through the world with things still to do before the night is finished. Pause. You have nothing left to do. Tonight, the receiving is complete. The 7 seals are open. The vault has given everything it was holding for this hour. And what remains is only this: the cedar, the dark, the slow breath of a body that has been given permission to do what it was made to do at this hour. Still, the cedar has a warmth, not the warmth of fire, not the warmth of something burning to produce heat. The warmth of something that has been holding for a very long time. The warmth that accumulates in the interior of a thing that has been closed and carrying and pressing gently against what it was built to protect for centuries. That warmth. Pause. It is not asking anything of you. It is not the warmth that requires a response, that expects you to tend it, or feed it, or make sure it does not go out. It is simply there, the accumulated warmth of centuries of cedar pressing gently against the manuscripts that were folded inside RR, and now pressing gently against you, the one the manuscripts were written for. Still, the cedar does not know that the waiting is over. That is not how cedar works. Cedar simply holds what it was built to hold for as long as it is needed, and then holds it still after the needing is finished, because holding is what cedar does, without effort, without the continuous application of intention against the possibility of releasing, simply holding. Pause. And you are inside that holding now, not metaphorically. The cedar of this hour, the dark of this room, the weight of what was given tonight. pressing gently, the way only centuries can press. All of it, holding, still. The manuscripts are resting. Sirach, folded carefully, in the cedar dark, still carrying the invitation. Come to me, you who desire me. Pause, resting. The wisdom of Solomon, folded beside it, still holding the 21 attributes, still carrying the word, Ra, the breath of the power of God, that animates whatever it touches. Pause, resting. Tobit, folded in the dark, still holding the architecture of the unseen world, still carrying the 7 who stand ready before the glory. Pause, resting. Judith, folded carefully, still holding the Gəbrat, the sacred daring of the person who acted from the interior, without waiting for permission. Pause, resting. First Maccabees, folded in the cedar dark, still holding the names of the ones who paid for the right to have the book in the room where they slept. Pause, resting. The Prayer of Manasseh, the shortest, the heaviest, folded beside the others, still carrying the prayer of the one who had no argument for why he should be heard. For you, O Lord, are the God of those who repent. Pause, resting. And to Baruch, the last, the one the elder carried longest, folded in the cedar dark, still carrying the description of this generation roamer. The youth of the world is past, the strength of the creation already exhausted. The pitcher near to the cistern, the ship near to the port, the journey near to the city, and the seal of the generation given to those who chose. Pause, resting, resting, still. All 7 in the cedar dark, resting, and the weight of what was inside them is in you now, not as something you must carry, not as a responsibility that the receiving placed upon you, not tonight. Tonight, it rests in you, the way the manuscripts rest in the cedar chest. Without demand, without urgency, without asking anything from the one who received them, simply present. Pause. In the cedar dark of this hour, still the body knows what this hour is for, not the mind. The mind is still moving the way minds move, at the edge of something they cannot quite follow, into the next place, still forming thoughts that have the shape of thoughts, but no longer the weight of them, still reaching for the next thing, the way a hand reaches in the dark for something it has set down and does not need until morning. Pause. The body knows. The body has known since long before this hour what this hour requires, and it has been waiting patiently, the way cedar waits, the way the manuscripts waited, the way the 7 books waited in the dark of the chest for the generation they were written for, waiting for the mind to finally stop reaching. Still. Let it stop, not dramatically, the way things stop at this depth of night, when the carrying is finished and the receiving is complete, and there is nothing left to hold except the cedar warmth of the dark, pressing gently. Pause, pause. The chest is closed now. Not locked, closed, the way things close when they have given everything they were holding, and what remains is only the cedar and the dark and the centuries of silence that surrounded the manuscripts while they waited and are surrounding you now. Still, the same silence that pressed against Sirach for 15 centuries in the island monasteries of Lake Tana, that held the wisdom of Solomon through the long debate about whether it belonged, that kept the prayer of Manasseh in the Ambrosian dark until the generation arrived that could receive it without condition. That silence, pause, is here in the room around you, pressing gently, still, not empty, full of what was given, and it is asking nothing of the one it is surrounding, nothing except this. Pause, rest, tensat. Still, the cedar holds tensat, the dark holds tensat, the silence holds tensat. The 7 books, folded carefully in the interior of the ancient chest, hold denchlat, and everything that was carried through the long night of this transmission is holding you now, tontetet, the way the cedar held what was folded inside it, somewhere in the text, in the memory, in the long keeping of what was almost not kept. Pause, tonight, was already known. Still, you arriving here, receiving this, the vault opening for exactly this person, in exactly this hour. Pause, that was already written. Ancient, not by the elder only carried what was given to carry, and gave it to the one it was given for. Pause, the giving is done. Still, what you carry out of this night is yours, not as a burden, as the thing that was folded carefully in the cedar dark for longer than this century can measure, and placed in the only hands it was ever meant to reach. Pause, yours, ancient, rest now. 10:10. The ancient yes has been spoken. 10:10. It was spoken before you arrived. Tonight, you received it. Tennet. It is done.